Just going to adjust that slightly. We are now joined by our guests from home on the Zoom, so we're ready to kick off. Welcome to our very last John Cain luncheon for the year. I'll start, as always, by acknowledging that we are gathered on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present, any First Nations people here with us today, and to those on the lands, the traditional owners of the lands from which you may be joining us at home. We've got a really lovely event today for our last event of the year. We're going to hear from Iola Mathews about her book. It's part memoir, part biography of her wonderful husband, Race, whom all of you know, I'm sure. You can buy the book if you would like to at the end of the event, and Iola's happy to sign them for you. They're $30. Meredith will take care of that for you. I wanted to say a few words before I let Iola start, and I apologise if I might get a little bit emotional. I would not be standing here today if it weren't for Race Mathews. Race was around when Per Capita was founded, almost 20 years ago. And of all the people involved then, he was the one who took me under his wing. I had no connection with the Labor Party, I had no connections with politics, and Race encouraged me very strongly to pursue a life of public policy. And he entrusted me with the editorship of the Australian Fabian's newsletter when I was just 31 years old, and really guided me on how to understand the issues that we address as a movement, as a Labor movement, and encouraged me all the while to keep pushing to try to find a career in this field. And until that point, I had no such support. He is a genuinely inclusive, intelligent, kind, welcoming man, the very best kind of politician that we have ever had in this country. And this book is a real testament to the impact he's had on so many lives as well as my own. So please welcome Iola.
Well, I feel quite emotional hearing that beautiful introduction from Emma, because 3 weeks ago Race went into a nursing home, and that's very sad for him and for us. But I'm sure he would be here in spirit today, and many of you, of course, know him very well. And I have to report that he's doing quite well. He's not complaining. He's being, as usual, agreeable, good self, and the kids are helping me to visit as much as we can, and at the moment he's with his grandson, and I think they're going to do some activity or other that in the nursing home, so it's all going, you know, as it should, just settling in time, and we're trying to get used to this very sad new period of our lives. So I better not dwell on that or I'll start to cry. So I'm going to talk to you about the book. I think some of you have read it, so I may be repeating what you've already read, but anyway, I thought what I'd do is just talk a bit about the book and read some little bits out of it today. What is the book about? Race has been a politician, an academic, an author, and reformer. He's had a very busy life, and he did something quite unusual in that he served at 3 levels of government. Not everybody has been at local government. He was on the Croydon Shire Council in his 20s, then in the federal government in the Whitlam era, and then finally in the state government, so 3 levels. And he was also, as you all know, a minister in the Cain-Kerner government. He believes, or he is rather driven by, a passion for fairness and justice and a commitment to equality, democracy and empowerment. And now I'll tell you why I wrote it. I think some of you know, but some of you may not, that in 2016, Race was asked by Monash University Publishing to write a memoir. He'd been sort of avoiding that for some time, although I'd been suggesting it. But once they asked him, you know, that they were going to publish it, he did put his head down, and he wrote quite a lot for the next 2 years until he was 81. But unfortunately, he then started to get what was then called mild cognitive impairment, and which later became Alzheimer's. And his eyes started to deteriorate, so that now he's only got central vision, and he's only got peripheral vision, and he's losing the central vision, so he hasn't been able to read or use a computer for quite a while. He was listening to talking books, but I'm afraid that's stopped for the moment. Anyway, in 2022, he got the diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and he had stopped the book because he couldn't do it. And I thought, well, I better get on with it, or else the book will never be written, and we want to have something on paper that people can read and take away. So fortunately, while he'd been doing it, we'd sorted all his papers chronologically and thematically, and the most valuable document of all was an oral history that he did in about 2014. A former journalist called Gary Sturgis had come to the house week after week after week and interviewing him, and did this really long oral history when Race's memory was good. So that was the absolutely core document that I used in writing the book. It was so valuable. And I decided that what I would do is condense what Race had written about his life to the first beginning of the book. It turned out to be 4 chapters. He had written about his life up to the age of 20, which is when he married his first wife. And it was really interesting, all the stories from his childhood. Sometimes stories from way back are better than the ones later on. And a writer friend of mine says that's because they're more composted. And it's a good word to use, I think. Anyway, he had left this, and I got that down to 4 chapters, and then the other 21 chapters or something were, what flowed from that chronologically about his life. And again, I tried to use his words wherever possible. And after all, he'd written an enormous amount over the years. There was plenty to go on. He'd written books, he'd written articles, he'd written pamphlets. He was always writing letters to the paper. I used to get cross on holidays with the children because after about a day he'd start writing a letter to the editor about some bugbear he had. There was just so much material, so it was really good to be able to pull it all together and put it into this book. So let's go back to the very early days of his socialist and political awakening. This is a chapter about Melbourne Grammar, where he went for his secondary school, not because his parents were rich, in fact the opposite. They really scrimped and saved to send their 3 boys to private schools. Absolutely scrimped and saved. I tell you, when I married Race and met his parents, his mother, if she had a hole in a tea towel, she'd darn it rather than buy a new tea towel. That was the kind of, modest life that they led. Anyway, he ended up at Melbourne Grammar. He always felt a bit of an outsider because he didn't come from a rich, posh family, and that was probably part of his socialist formation. Anyway, he went to Melbourne Grammar, and in the Melbourne Grammar Library, surprisingly, there was a whole shelf full of socialist and communist books. And he always says that The Socialist Six of the World was the book that changed his life, and he suddenly saw that there could be equality and a different form of society. So while he was delving into all these books that somehow crept into Melbourne Grammar Library, he made friends with some other boys who were there, and they formed a sort of role-playing group called the Drei Kaiserbund about the early, kings and princes and so on before the First World War. And then they decided to form a mock parliament. And they were allowed to do this, and they were given a teacher who became the sort of de facto Governor-General. And they did it really well. It was run exactly like a real parliament with, they all became an MP. He was the MP for Hampton, where he grew up. They had parties, and they had motions, and they had votes, and they followed all the rules. And it was a wonderful education for somebody who later became a Member of Parliament. So he started off making himself the leader of the Communist Party. This was 1950, and the school parliament passed the Communist Party dissolution bill, and so he no longer had a party. But in the real world, as you all know, it went to the High Court and a referendum, and it didn't pass. But in the school, there was nobody to appeal to, so he lost out. So he just very quickly became leader of the Labor Party, and at some point in the school parliament, as leader of the Labor Party, he formed a coalition with some of the Liberals. Most of the others were Liberal National Party. And they formed a coalition, and he became the Prime Minister. Well, the other blokes weren't going to put up with that, so they roped in some of their mates like Barry Humphries, and there was a rabbi, a man who later became a rabbi. There was Rob McClellan, who later became a Liberal Party MP and minister. Anyway, these Conservatives ganged up and they had a coup and got rid of him as the Prime Minister. So then he just became a backbencher. And at some stage he had a run-in with the Governor-General as well. So he always said it was a good experience not to trust other MPs or Governors-General. Good, education for his future life. So then he left school and went to Teachers College, and on the first day on the tram going up to Toorak Teachers College as it was then, he met this very nice young woman called Geraldine McEwen, who they then became inseparable, and she became his first wife. And when they graduated, they went to Gippsland because they were bonded, as you were in those days, had to teach in a country school. And Race taught in a little one-person, one-teacher school. He was called the head teacher, but he was also the only teacher, in Yunnar South in Gippsland, just a tiny little place, and he boarded with a family who were dairy farmers. And just recently I had a letter from one of the daughters of that family, had stumbled upon the book and remembered Race when she was a 9-year-old student and had no idea that this bloke who lived, in the dairy farm would turn out to be what he did. So the book's been amazing. People come out of the woodwork that you didn't know about before. So they taught in Gippsland, and when they were 20, still in Gippsland, he was 20, she was 19, they got married, and they had to have their parents' permission because they were underage. And then they proceeded to have children. By the middle 20s, he already had 3 children. And when they left Gippsland, they came to live in Croydon, which was then an outer suburb with, no made roads, just a lot of mud, no sewerage. The Duddy can man came and collected and all that stuff. So they were in a very primitive suburb in a way. And Race got involved in trying to develop services and got elected to the local council. At the same time, the education department was putting out an advertisement that they wanted people to train as speech therapists, and they paid their salary. They said, go away and come back when you've got your degree. We don't want to hear from you. And Race had an experience in his little school in Gippsland with children who couldn't speak properly and what a handicap it was, and he was quite interested. So he signed up and became a clinical speech therapist with the education department after he graduated. At the same time, he was very busy, getting busy in the local Croydon ALP, and he ran a couple of campaigns for other people, parliamentary campaigns, and he stood for the seat of Box Hill himself, and didn't win, but was doing his apprenticeship, learning, as you do, all the things to get, busy and active in the Labor Party. Then at the age of 25, he became secretary of the Fabian Society, and that became a very central part of his life for the whole of the rest of his life. And for nearly 50 years, on and off, more on than off, he was running the Fabian Society. And he built it in those early days up from being a very small organisation to really a very effective think tank, really, for the Whitlam government. There weren't any, I don't know that there were any other think tanks around at the time. And so people who joined, like John Button, became, potential members of Parliament, and also Barry Jones, people like that, and they wrote pamphlets about policy issues, which then became, basic policy for Whitlam's government. So while he was running the Fabian Society, very early, back in the 50s, he asked Gough Whitlam to speak. At that stage, Gough was not even the leader of the Labor Party, but all of the Fabians were deeply impressed by Whitlam. And at the same night, he met John Menadue, who was Whitlam's principal private secretary at the time. And Menadue was building up a network of experts on policy issues, mainly in Sydney and Canberra. And he asked Race and Race's friend David Bennett if they would help with contacts in Melbourne. And in that way, Race became close to Menadue and started to get a little bit close to the whole Whitlam apparatus. And so when, in 1967, when Menadue decided to leave Whitlam because he was exhausted by the workload, never seeing his family, he tapped Race on the shoulder, and Race was very thrilled to take the job, and then became Whitlam's PPS from 1967 until 1972. Now, it's hard to believe it, but in those days, the leader of the opposition had only three staff people and 3 support staff. Nowadays, they've probably got dozens of them. But there was Race doing policy work and some speeches, and this network they were building up of experts. There was Graham Freudenberg, who of course was the great speechwriter and guru and colleague of Race's, Whitlam. And then there was, first of all, Peter Cullen, and then later on Dick Hall, who were the journalists who looked after the media, they looked after the community contacts, the Labor Party and a whole lot of other things. And then there were 2 secretaries and a receptionist. That was it. Very small, very bonded, very close group together. So Race didn't know Whitlam very well at all when he took the job, and he hadn't been to Canberra, he didn't know the office, he hadn't been briefed. Menadue had left some months earlier, so it was a bit of a baptism of fire. And I'd just like to read you the first day to give you the flavour of what he was in for. So this is the chapter called Working for Whitlam. Minutes after I had installed myself in my new Parliament House office in Canberra, now the old Parliament House, for the first time, the door which connected it with Whitlam's office suddenly burst open. Whitlam emerged, shouting for me to produce from Hansard, a publication with which I then had no more than a nodding acquaintance, the answer to a question on notice about the DFRB, an acronym of which I had never heard and which he did not explain. The shouting continued while I fumbled and failed to comply, and his face turned more and more purple until a tactful intervention by another staff member diffused the situation and he vanished again behind the door. Race's rescuer was one of the secretaries, Barbara Stewart, who had become a good friend like all the Whitlam staff. Hansard was the official record of Parliament, and the DFRB was the Defence Force Retirement Benefit Scheme. Barbara explained that Gough's explosions were not personal and Race should not take offence. And this is what Race said: I was to learn that such episodes were a way of Whitlam relieving his frustrations with the still largely inert majority of his parliamentary colleagues and the shambles in which he had inherited the Labor Party from Cornwall, particularly in Victoria. Sweetness and light would prevail again 10 or so minutes later, but the heat was fierce while it lasted. So Race then worked for Whitlam on policy work, particularly education and Medibank. And it's really quite sad. I've explained in the book how the dream of what those policies were meant to be has been eroded and really turned on its head in subsequent years. So, Race was very involved from even before he went to work with Whitlam on the education policy, about the Schools Commission and needs-based funding, getting the Catholic schools to get federal funding, which they'd never had before, and that brought the Catholic vote back into the Labor Party and helped Whitlam win. The idea was that the rich schools would not get any money and the rest of them would get it on a needs basis. Well, you know what's happened today. The rich schools are overfunded. They're having ridiculous amounts of money to have huge monumental sports centres and art centres, and I saw one even had a barista and so forth. So, it's very sad that that's where we've ended up at the moment, even under a Labor government. And then with Medibank, of course, Medicare, there's a whole chapter on Medicare and Medibank. That was also meant to be a bit different to what it is today. There was not meant to be private health insurance, and it's been changed over the years. Anyway, he had a very busy time and a very fruitful time developing that, and also policies on urban and regional development. And in that he found a lot of similarities with Gough, because they both lived in outer suburbs, outer suburban electorates where there were very few services, and they were trying to develop things, no sewerage and that sort of thing. So they used to chat about that and found a lot of similarities. I guess you could also say there was another similarity, that both had their wives and children at home looking after things in the electorate and at home, while the blokes were off being very busy with their work and hardly ever home. So, summing up, I'll read what he said about that time, working for Gough and with the other people. It was a privilege to belong to Whitlam's staff. We were a small, tight-knit group. We worked long hours, but there was tremendous camaraderie and fun. We knew each other in a time of great hope and optimism, and we had a dream of a better world. We shared the job satisfaction of working for Gough and the development and formation of policies for the Whitlam government. I'm deeply grateful for all that Whitlam gave me and meant to me. My life was incomparably richer for knowing him. I was in awe of him. He gave back hope to my generation and made the ALP electable. The good things that happened to me in my career and subsequent years were due largely to lessons that he taught me. And he was asked later on, what was best, working for Gough or being a minister? And he said, I could be Prime Minister or Secretary General of the UN or the Pope, and I wouldn't exchange it for any of them. Working for Whitlam was the best. Now, while he was working for Gough, sadly, tragedy struck the Mathews and the family. In 1969, Race's wife, Jill, became ill with cancer, and they were not able to cure it, and she died a year later. Race's parents moved into the house to look after the children, and Race continued to work for Gough, being in Canberra nearly all the time. Then a year later, I met him through my work at The Age, and at the same time, he became candidate for Casey. He thought that this would be something he could give to Gough, winning a seat that was called a litmus test seat. It had been Liberal for a long time, and it was swinging, like everything else, towards Labor. And when I met him, I found it really interesting to hear his funny stories about working with Gough, and I'll just share one with you. It was when Race turned 33, Gough said to him, "Comrade, what have you achieved? At 33, Alexander had conquered the world and Jesus Christ had saved it." There's lots of stories like that, of course. Whitlam was so witty. Anyway, a year later, we got married, and at our wedding, Gough was the guest of honour, and I've put in a story in there about the wedding, about how my mother, who voted Liberal, and so did my father at the time, she was terribly worried that all of their friends would be on one side of the room, and all of ours would be on the other side of the room, and they would never talk to each other. We were in a friend's home. Anyway, it turned out it was all right, because halfway through the evening, my mother took her best friend up to meet Gough. Now, they were about 5'1". Gough's up there, 6'3" or whatever he was. They're almost talking to his waist. Anyway, my mother said, "Mr. Whitlam, I'd like you to meet my friend Jean Hardy. She was the bridesmaid at my wedding many years ago." And Gough said, "Well, kiss me hardy." And he bent down and kissed her on both cheeks. And she walked away at Mrs. Hardy saying, "Isn't he gorgeous? I'm not going to wash my face for a week." So, yeah, all was well. The wedding was a great success. And then, of course, 3 months later, in December that year, Gough won the election and Race won Casey, and we were all euphoric, and all our party members were euphoric, and everything looked wonderful, and the Whitlam government would be in for years, it would all be wonderful, and we had no idea what was really going to happen. So Race was the MP for Casey from 1972 to 75. He went in with the wave and out with the wave. And he was very hard-working, as you would expect. He had an office in the electorate, and he bought an old dental van and had it fitted out as a mobile office, and he used to drive around on the weekends to shopping centres and the rural areas, and people could come and have a meeting in the mobile van. In the Parliament he was busy. He chaired 2 parliamentary committees, and he was often speaking about issues that had arisen in the electorate or had a national significance. Then, of course, in 1975, we know how things started to go downhill, and the whole of that year was, really very painful to watch, see the headlines and hear what was going on as things went downhill. Race and I were pretty clear by the end of the year that, even before the dismissal, that things were going badly. And then 2 days before the dismissal, I gave birth to my second baby and hemorrhaged and was in grave risk of losing my life, because I was out at Lilydale Bush Nursing Hospital, and they sent an ambulance down to the women's to pump me full of blood again. And poor Race saw me disappear in the ambulance and had to go back to Canberra because, you know, they were waiting to have, a half Senate election, which I think they thought was going to save the day with the blocking of supply. Anyway, a couple of days later I was in the women's hospital and somebody walked past my room and said, "Gough Whitlam's been sacked." And I said, "Don't be bloody stupid." So I ran down the corridor looking for somebody to explain and found a radio, and you know, we all know what happened on that day. And Race was just as bamboozled. I've said in the book what he was doing, walking around the lake with David Mackenzie, whose son's here today, and Tony Lamb, and they didn't know what was going on much either until about lunchtime or the afternoon things started to slowly become clear. And so of course then we had the election after the dismissal, and the Labor government fell and Race lost his electorate. We were all devastated. And Race, I might say, has never forgiven Malcolm Fraser, never forgiven Sir John Kerr. I know they're dead, but he never did forgive them. Even though Whitlam seemed to make some conciliatory gestures to Fraser, Race never forgave them. So then he's out of work, he's got 5 kids and a wife to support. What's he going to do? He thought he would go back to university and get a degree and maybe become an academic. And he trotted off to Melbourne University, but shortly afterwards, Robert Redlich, who was president of the Victorian Party, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "We need you to come and work for the leader of the opposition in Victoria." At that stage it was Clyde Holding and later on Frank Wilkes. So Race went in there as principal private secretary to them and tried to adopt some of the methods that the Whitlam office had introduced and, you know, whip it into shape. And I think it's Robert Ray who claims that, I didn't put this in the book, but I heard later, he claims that Race found these sackloads of letters that had never been opened. The office was so dysfunctional, and some of them had cheques with money in them. Anyway, they got it all into shape again. And then during that time in state politics, he became, in 1979, he was tapped on the shoulder to go to Oakley by Robert Ray and became the MP for Oakley. And one of the reasons he won Oakley from the Liberals was he and Tom Roper, who was the Shadow Minister for Health, worked very hard on trying to get the Monash Medical Centre set up, which the Libs had been talking about but had never done anything. And that became a huge issue in the area and you know, became a great vote winner for Labor, making mockery of those who weren't doing anything and saying that as soon as Labor got in, they would. And you know, we all know what it is today, a very great teaching hospital and centre for medical for that area. So then in 1982, the Cain government was elected, and Race had been shadowing tourism and economic development, but John Cain called him into his office on about the first day and said, "I'd like you to be the Minister for Police and Emergency Services." And Race said, "You've got to be joking." And John Cain said, "No, I want a diplomat to work with, you need a diplomat to work with the coppers, and that's you." So Race said, "Well, for light relief, could I please have the arts?" And John had given it to someone else, but he managed to get it back and give it to Race. So that was a very happy coincidence for Race. And the next day, the Age editorial called him the Minister for Pigs and Prigs. So what did he, some of the things that he achieved during that time, the 5 or 6 years he was a minister, in the police he worked very, very closely with Mick Miller, who was the Chief Commissioner. And as soon as Race met Mick, he said to him, "I'd like us to have lunch together, just sandwiches in my office every Monday. We won't have any staff, we won't have any minutes, we won't tell anyone what we've discussed, but we will get along and we will sort things out without having any, you know, embarrassing fights and so forth, and then we'll carry on that way." And they did. They became very good friends, and Mick Miller asked Race to give the eulogy at his funeral. Unfortunately, by then Race wasn't able to, but it was a measure of how close they were, and they kept having lunch all the way after Race was the minister until Mick died. So one of the things he did was bring in gun reform, which was quite difficult in country meetings where people were opposed to any gun reform. He conducted a major review of the police force, and he was busy after the Ash Wednesday bushfires in improving disaster management, and all that kept him very busy. Then with the arts, which also kept him busy, during that time they opened the Arts Centre on Southbank and established the Spoleto International Arts Festival, the Melbourne Writers Festival, and a whole lot of other arts activities. And Race absolutely adored the arts. He was out every single night, and not home with the children, I might add. And I used to say sometimes, look, they get you up, the driver would come at 8 in the morning, he'd get up at 6 and start writing. He was doing academic work as well. The driver would come at 8, he'd be busy all day, and then every evening he was at an arts function, come home at about midnight. I used to think, you know, as a journalist, I'll get the inside story about what's going on in this government, but I never did because he'd just fall asleep. So I had to read the paper the next day and find out what was going on. Anyway, it was a great time. You know, there were the very interesting portfolios. And then after 5 years, he was shifted to community services. And that was an area, the one that he focused on most was child protection, because it was still in the early days of child protection, and it needed a lot more staff, it needed a lot more attention. It still does, it's a sort of a bottomless pit. But he was very involved with that, and he also oversaw the deinstitutionalisation of the intellectually disabled, which was another issue that was busy at that time. So then after those years as a minister, he no longer was a minister because the younger people in the faction, he was in what they call Centre Unity, wanted to be in the cabinet, and the leaders of the faction needed to tap somebody on the shoulder. So I won't say who it was, but they tapped somebody else on the shoulder who said, F off. You know, if you try to get rid of me, I'll cause a by-election and you'll be in trouble. So then they tapped Race on the shoulder, who was always very polite, and said, oh yes, I understand, younger people want to go, well, all right, I'll dip out, which he did. So, you know, very gentlemanly, and lost his place in the cabinet. So then, of course, we had the decline of the Kerner government, and they lost in '92, and then Race lost his electorate at the same time. So while he was in the cabinet and afterwards, Race became very, very interested in the cooperative movement. Way back in 1981, Shirley Williams, who was the London secretary of the Fabian Society, was a great pen pal with Race, who was running the Australian Fabian Society, and she told him about this place in the Basque region of Spain called Mondragon, which was a great centre of worker cooperatives. And Race became so interested in reading about it that he then went to visit it and ended up making about 7 trips there over the next decade or two. He was fascinated by the fact that you had these nearly 100 different cooperatives. You also had a cooperative bank, you had a cooperative university, the whole social security system was working as a cooperative, and the whole thing sort of gelled together. So you had a job for life. If your job was going to disappear, they would retrain you for a different cooperative, or they would start another one. And it's ended up today, I looked at the annual report a couple of years ago, that they've now got something like 100 subsidiaries around the world. They're all over Europe, and they're still very successfully operating out of the Basque region. Now, it doesn't entirely translate into other countries, but Race was an idealist, and he loved the idea that this world of sort of more equal people and people who had empowerment and democracy and so on existed somewhere in the world, and he tried to tell people about it. So not everybody agreed with him, I might say, although he did get a lot of followers who were interested in Mondragon. But one of my friends who used to hear Race banging on about it said to me, is he still talking about Mogadon? Which was for those of you who don't know, that was a sleeping pill. And Race said later, Gough regarded it as a deplorable idiosyncrasy and departure from reality on my part. So he didn't get any sympathy from Gough, but Race didn't mind. He just kept going on about what interested him. So when the Kerner government fell and Race lost his seat of Oakley, he then went into academia. So he went off to Monash Public Sector Management Institute, where he lectured on how governments operate and also ran some conferences and seminars and the like. And then at the age of 60, a few years later, he became interested not just in Mondragon but in how the whole idea of cooperatives had operated in many countries, particularly in the eastern coast of Canada. Both of them were linked by the origins out of Catholic social justice, and priests who wanted to help unemployed people had set up cooperatives as a way of job creation. So he went to Canada and he researched what had happened there. He went to Europe, and his first book came out of that with a PhD, and the book was called Jobs of Our Own, Building a Stakeholder Society. So while he was at Monash, he then one day picked up a book in the Monash Library about distributism, which was a sort of basic philosophy people have largely moved on from, about a distribution of wealth and power into a more equal society. And he realised again that that was linked to Catholic social teaching coming out of a Catholic encyclical called Rerum Novarum. So Race decided to enrol in a Doctor of Theology, which was a strange thing to do because he's basically a non-believer and never been a Catholic or anything else. But he wanted to get into the Catholic archives, and the only way he could do that was to be at the Catholic Theological College where he enrolled. And he had two priests as his supervisors. They were professors in history and various other things, absolutely lovely people. And he really enjoyed himself doing that second doctorate. And out of that came the book of Labour and Liberty, Distributism in Victoria, 1891 to 1966, because it was mainly about how in the early part of the 20th century, the Catholic Church, through its parishes, developed credit unions, credit cooperatives and other sorts of cooperatives. And it was mainly a way of people, after the church, pooling their savings and trying to help each other buy things when they were in poor communities. And so he was sort of inspired by how that happened, and then how Santa Maria killed it off, and it's another story that's in the book. So again, after he left the Parliament, he became very interested in reforming the Labor Party. He'd always believed that the factions should be, as he said, on tap and not on top. And he was concerned that branch members were not having enough say, the party was shrinking, it was ageing, and the factions were getting more and more powerful and making all the decisions, so the branch members felt disempowered. And the first thing he did was get very involved in our local branch in Paran and run that, and then started running the FEA, which involves more than one branch, and turned that into quite a dynamic organisation. He also set up a couple of statewide organisations, one called Local Labour and one called Open Labour, and then Jamie Button, John Button's son, started, and I think his was Open Labour. Anyway, there were several of these things going on, all trying to revive the power of the branches with, mixed success, I must say. Then in 2010, the Faulkner-Bracks Carr report came out into the Labor Party federally, and one of the things it recommended was a national campaigning, organising and training academy, which Race had been thinking about for years. And I used to say to him, why don't you and some of the former MPs just go and talk to the branch members about the history of the party, the values, the way it operates. And that was the sort of the idea that he wanted to turn into something bigger. And he talked a lot with John Faulkner and Bracks and Carr, particularly Faulkner, about how to make that happen. And so he started with some helpers to do that in different states, but it wasn't very popular with the factional leaders, and it didn't really get a lot of traction. But more recently, Professor Janet McCalmont has been running the Labor Academy, or what's left of it, in Victoria, with Zoom meetings of events and discussions and policy making and so on. And that is, what arose out of Race and others' campaign for an academy, and I think it will probably, hopefully, grow over time. But there's still a need for reform, and one of the things that Race was most concerned about going to Labor Party conferences was the fact that the Labor Party rule for secret ballots is not carried out at all. He watched people come into a conference, pick up their ballot paper, give it to the factional boss to fill out and go home. A complete travesty of what democracy should be. And he was always writing and talking about that. And then Eric Derricott, who's the only independent member of the Victorian Executive, took it up a couple of years ago and actually took it to the Disputes Tribunal. And a lawyer called Ross Howie brought down a finding that they should have secret ballots. You know, they should provide a little place where you can fill out your ballot paper and not let anybody else see. But unfortunately that has again been subverted by those who run the conferences. So there's still work to be done. And more recently, pre-selections were taken away from the local people, and that's another issue that some are still campaigning for. So by the time Race was, well, he's now nearly 90, I guess until about 2 years ago he was still active. And I think his attitude can probably be summed up best by what I've said at the end of the book, which is, Race can no longer be involved in party reform or the academy, but he's philosophical about that. Despite the frustrations of waning eyesight and fading memory, he's reached the age of acceptance, saying, others will have to take up the fight now. His philosophy is summed up in the last line of his 2017 book of Labour and Liberty, in which he quotes from the movie Terminator 2, Judgment Day, quote, the future is not set, there is no fate, but what we make of it ourselves, unquote. Thank you.
Thank you. We're happy to have a little chat with people. I mean, it's going to be more of a chat than a Q&A, I think, at this point. Wonderful speech, thank you, and a reflection on many things that were going on when Per Capita was first starting as well, with a lot of those same people. Who'd like to make a comment or ask a question of Iola? We've got a microphone just so that those at home can hear you. If you...
Thank you.
No? We'll... or it'll run round the other way.
Thank you. Thank you. What a fascinating talk about a fascinating life. I thought I wanted to make an apology to Race, but for something I did in 1977. But given the success he had in the years since 1977, I'm not sure whether it's an apology or not. He took me to lunch. I think it was at Pellegrini's in Burke Street. And he paid for the lunch and I never paid him back. So I apologise for that. The reason he wanted to have lunch with me was that at that time I exercised a little influence in part of the Labor Party called the Batman FEA, Federal Electorate Assembly. Race, who was no longer member for Casey, wanted to become member for Batman, and for that he needed my support. I can remember sitting with him there at lunch and saying, thank you, Race. As much as I appreciate who you are and what you are, I am already committed to Brian Howe. Now, Brian Howe usually sits over here somewhere at these meetings with his wife Renata. They're not here today, but I shifted my numbers, David McKenzie will remember this, across to Brian Howe, who went on to become member for Batman and then Deputy Prime Minister. In doing that, did I deny Race an opportunity, or did I open up for him other opportunities? If I denied him an opportunity, I apologise. If in fact I was merely a stepping stone for him on his path to some other successful life, then I withdraw my apology.
Well, could you just tell us your name so I can tell you know, send this semi-apology back to Race?
David Jones, he knew me as.
Yes.
Right, well, there's a section in the book about this Batman story that sure Race was looking for a seat, and he says in his oral history, I was a complete babe in the woods about factional matters. I was a complete idiot, really, going to Batman and uprooting the whole family to move house before he'd even won it, because he thought that he would get the vote of his faction, and all the independents who'd been the participants, all his mates, Barry Jones, John Button, all of those, what he didn't know is they'd done a deal with the left so that Brian Howe would get up in Batman and John Button would get up in the Senate. And he was, you know, just made a big boo-boo, really. Never mind. When he lost that, then Robert Ray tapped him on the shoulder to go Oakley and everything was fine. No need to apologise.
Well, that's reassuring for me because I was told by my old boss that I was a complete numpty when it comes to factions the other day, and he's not wrong. So I'm in good company. Who's next? Come on. Janet, you must want to say something.
Race has been such an inspiration. It's the consistency of his values and which he's lived. I mean, he just didn't spout them, he lived them, which is so inspirational through the party. I hope that the ideas about cooperatives, distributism, will get some new resonance. I think we've seen in this defeat of sort of progressive liberalism in America with the election, where the older model of social democracy has begun to fail because it's been captured by the educated, and that the great divide now is between the educated and the uneducated. And the uneducated are saying, hang on, you're not listening to us, we've got no power, we don't have the words, we need to be in the game too. And maybe these are ways in which socialism, democratic socialism, can work so that everyone participates, not just those who've got a PhD, which I regard largely as a disadvantage in politics.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. I think that's an interesting topic about the divide between the educated and less educated, because some people are saying, oh, Labor's lost the working class and the Liberals are picking them up. But under Whitlam, we had both the working class and the educated, you know, intellectual new sort of rising star middle class and whatever, and I don't see why Labor should obviously try to do both. Thanks.
More coming down the front.
I suppose the really big sort of change in the Labor Party was 1970, when with federal intervention, which completely reformed the party. Does Race write about that at all?
Yes, there's a whole section about intervention. That was before he was working for Gough, but he was involved with his friend David Bennett in that and many other people as well. It was quite cataclysmic, really, what they did, because the party had been split for so long and they couldn't get over that until they cleaned up the Victorian branch. Yeah, so it's in the book. Buy the book.
It's all in the book.
And could I just make a plea to everybody here? I'm saying this whenever I make a speech. Please ask your local library to buy a copy, because some of you will know that if you're a writer and if you have 50 or more books in libraries, you get a tiny payment from public lending, right? And so we want people to get them into libraries.
We'll do that.
Well, the 14th of September 1970 was in fact a vital date in the life of the Labor Party in Australia, because that's the date of intervention. But Race was active, of course, in the Fabians before that, and what a terrible desert experience it was to be in the Labor Party in the years before 1970, when it was dominated by one faction which controlled everything. I recall when I was first active in the Fabians were almost declared to be a bogus organisation, which would have meant that you couldn't be a member of the Labor Party and a Fabian. And that was because Race had written to the Federal Secretary of the Labor Party and obtained a copy of the report that had been prepared on how the party might be reformed to make it more participatory. And he was sent 400 copies of it. I think he only needed the one, but so he sent the copies around to the secretaries of the local branches of the Labor Party in Victoria, and the Central Executive was so infuriated that it was then a struggle to protect the Fabian Society from being declared bogus. Now that would have been a bit of a tragedy, because I was just working it out that it's now 140 years this year since the Fabians were founded in Britain. And that's an example of middle-class intellectuals working with working-class unions to reform society. When you look at the changes that have occurred in the last 140 years in industrial safety and social welfare in so many ways, it's really quite a staggering achievement. And I go along with those who say that race has been an inspiration.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the problem the Fabians had with the central executive, but Race distributed something else as well, which was called the Scoresby Letter to all the branches complaining about the central executive, and they hauled him up and tried to expel him, and he says in his oral history that he only won because he knew the rule book better than they did.
There is a saying that he also serves who only stands and waits, but Fabians should have a slogan that says they also serve who only pay their subs. So if you're not a member, please join the Fabian Society.
And one final comment over here, and then we'll wrap
Sorry,
up.
Bob Owens.
Yes, Bob.
I had the invidious position of replacing Race as Secretary of the Fabian Society when he resigned. People remarked the Fabian Society declined completely. However, it's worthwhile recording, I think, just what a platform for Whitlam the Fabian Society was in those years, when he was virtually banned from appearing in Victoria. And they were terribly exciting days when you would send a telegram, we used telegrams in those days, to Gough saying, please come and address us. And we would receive an enthusiastic reply that afternoon accepting. And I think that, that certainly as a pro-Whitlamite group within the ALP, the last speaker was right. Its role was most commendable.
Thank you.
Thank you, Iola. Thanks so much for sharing this book with us today. We're leaving a few minutes for you to buy one and for Iola to sign it for you, but join me in saying thank you. And we, of course, are sending our love to Race today. Miss him greatly, and I hope to see him again soon. This is our final lunch for the year, folks. It was lovely to see many of you at the John Cain oration last week. Iola mentioned the work that Janet McColman's doing with the Labour Academy. She's got her little red books here. And there will be a Labour Academy event next Wednesday evening online on housing, and featuring myself and the Honourable Richard Wynne, and it will be moderated by our own Sarah Mackenzie, whom I would like to acknowledge has just been elected the Deputy Mayor of the City of Yarra. Congratulations, Sarah. That's quite an achievement at 33. I'd say that's up there with Jesus. So you're not quite there. She's still got years to go.
My Jesus years are coming.
Jesus years are coming. But yes, Sarah is a new Labor councillor for the City of Yarra, Yarra Bend Ward. We could not be more thrilled. Congratulations. But she's not leaving us entirely, so that's very important. Per Capita will continue the work that that Race did for so long. Our friends at the Fabian Society, we're talking about doing some pre-election events with them next year. We're also looking at holding a rather large and what could be a fairly disruptive conversation on tax reform ahead of the election. Keep an eye out for that. I can see Bill Kelty rolling his eyes at me. I'll make sure it works, Bill, I promise. Thank you all so much. Stay in touch. We'll be back on the 19th of February next year. There's a fair bit that's going to go on between now and then, and we'll be heading into an election, so lots of work to do. Thank you all for your ongoing support. I aged you.